Good afternoon. I think we can start. So welcome to our annual Talking Poles lecture that promotes our Polish program and Slavic studies, largely at Brown. And so today's lecture is the third in the series and features our very own excellent Brown professor, Michael Kennedy, who will deliver a talk titled Polish, Ukrainian, and Global Solidarities and Transformations in Epoch Ends. But before I introduce Professor Kennedy properly, let me introduce myself very briefly, I promise, and say just a few words about what we do here when it comes to the Polish program. So my name is Paulina Duda. Don't think I am related to the Polish president. I am a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Slavic Studies. And so what do we do here at Brown? We offer a range of Polish language courses at different levels and also courses on Polish and East European film and literature within the Slavic department. But we are also quite fortunate to have faculty members at Brown in various departments, including history, Judaic studies, sociology, and Watson, who teach courses with a strong Polish flavor. And additionally, and that's probably the best part when we think about from the student's perspective, we also, through our partnership with the Polish National Agency for Academic Exchange, Brown students taking Polish language and culture classes are eligible for fellowships to complete summer language and culture studies in different Polish cities. Last summer, 9 of our brave souls decided to receive the fellowships, and according to really verified sources, they had the time of their lives. I have no idea what that entails. You would have to ask them. But I was kind of jealous of the experience. On top of that, we are also quite well equipped to assist students in arranging internships with established institutions in Poland. Finally, we are super fortunate to have a very active and vibrant student-run Polish-American club sitting just here at the front, which is a mastermind really behind numerous social events, workshops, and talks, including this one. So I'm really, truly thankful that they are such a meaningful part of the Polish program. The VIPs are here, so some of them will say just a few words about what they do, because their engagement is remarkable when you think about, the cooperation with faculty members, between students and different Slavic matters. It's really remarkable. So if you can help welcome the VIPs.
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica. I am one of those children who was in Poland this summer, and I am a verified source, and I can tell you it was tons of fun, and that's all I'm legally allowed to say. So,
yes, and I'm Carolina. Nice to meet you all today. Me and Jess are co-presidents of the Polish American Club at Brown, and also thank you everyone for coming today and braving the cold to be here, and also thank you Professor Kennedy also for joining us today. And the Polish American Club, we founded the club to kind of bring awareness to the Polish community at Brown and also the broader Slavic community at Brown as well. And we do a variety of events like speaker events like this one, and we also do some more casual movie nights and cultural events. And we also collab with other student groups like CCB and Brown Cooking Club. And so if you're interested in any events like these, let us know.
yeah, we're really excited to be with Brown Cooking Club hosting a pierogi making workshop, which is like the quintessential Polish just experience. There will be no babcis yelling at us, but that's okay. And then, we really try to make a space where all the special cultural quirks of Poland can be, we can have a shared community through that. Like Śmigus Dingus, we did something last spring for that. That's us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So as I said, the Polish American Club co-sponsors this talk along with the Slavic Studies Department and Watson Institute. After the talk, we'll have a Q&A session and followed by an open reception just outside of this room. So don't rush into the cold. Stay, hang out with us. Have a glass of wine if you are above 21. I'm not going to check the IDs. They're I think, people doing that. So now let's get to the heart of today's talk. That is Professor Michael Kennedy. So, you know, it's what is really annoying about introducing a person of such stature as Professor Kennedy is that it's literally impossible to condense his biographical information in less than 5 hours, let's say. I will try, because this is your talk, not mine. So let me just mention the highlights of your life. So Michael Kennedy, oh, no, nothing compromising. Michael Kennedy is a professor of sociology and of international and public affairs at Brown University. He conducted his dissertation fieldwork in 1983-84 in Poland, and I'm saying that not so they can calculate how old are you, but just for you, yeah, for those of you who are more familiar with the Polish history, you can get a sense how important that time was to conduct any kind of field work. And that resulted in the publishing of his first book titled Professionals, Power and Solidarity in Poland, a critical sociology of Soviet-type society. He then continued his research with a particular focus on Western business advisors going to Poland, which materialized in the form of his second book titled Cultural Formations of Post-Communism, Emancipation, Transition, Nation and War. He didn't stop there. He wrote a third book. Luckily, it's the last one. Globalizing Knowledge, Intellectuals, Universities and Publics in Transformation, and many, many, many articles and edited volumes in most high-ranking academic journals, both in the United States and in Poland. Professor Kennedy is also the recipient of an equally long list of awards. You're really reading through your CV was a long homework for me. So with one noteworthy highlight. So in 1999, Professor Kennedy was honored with a very prestigious Gold Cross of Merit for the Republic of Poland, presented by the then President of Poland, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, and trust me, it really is a big deal. Finally, before coming to Brown, Professor Kennedy was instrumental in shaping and developing a Polish program, Polish like Central European Studies at the University of Michigan, and the Polish program there now is the biggest in the nation. So please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Kennedy.
Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much. First of all, thanks for this invitation to do this. Paulina and her VIPs have been thinking about this for a while, apparently. And when they approached me in September or so, or August, or I don't know when, but certainly before October 7th, I was thinking about how wonderful it would be to be able to share some of the work I've been doing on Polish solidarities throughout my career, but on Ukrainian solidarities, especially since 2013 and 2014. And I would have had no idea that when I agreed to give that talk, that I'd have to develop a completely new talk. But I'm very glad to do so, because if there's anything that's rewarding about being a professor, and especially about being a sociologist, is that we are often able to be engaged in the most important transformations in the world. And so this is a great pleasure for me to try to put together the meaningfulness of Polish solidarity, Ukrainian solidarity, and global solidarity, especially with Israel-Palestine in mind. So I will say, too, that for those who have taken my classes, you know that my PowerPoints are impossible to consume in the moment. And that's why I put them up on academia.edu later for you to go back to it if you want. They're just there to give you something to look at in case you get tired of looking at me. So this is how I framed the lecture for October 13th. On October 13th. And you can see that I was still thinking primarily about Poland and Ukraine. But I was deliberately leaving open, because in those 6 days since October 7th, I could tell that we were going to be wrestling with the qualities of solidarity, given the profundity of the transformations that we were about to experience. The other thing that I've been doing for the last couple of years is also thinking about what I call epoch end. And the way I've been thinking about epoch end had to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it also had to do with COVID-19. For the people who are taking my course on power, knowledge, and justice and global social change, they were also writing up their own epoch ends. Some of my favorites were, when rock truly died. So that is an epoch end. You're supposed to be smiling at that. We don't have to be always deadly serious. In fact, we need a little joy in order to be able to persist. So I don't like to think about the death of rock, but I mention it. I am teaching PKJ next term, so if anyone is interested in this, tell your youngers, especially if you're already an elder. But what I want to do is to go through a few themes today and invite a meaningful conversation about the times in which we're living and how to think about solidarity in these times. But I want us to do that not only on the basis of our particular expertise, but our interest in extending our learning and extending our understanding so that we can understand the world in which we're living. So I am going to ask that you let me go through it all, because I want us to be able to have all of it in our sensibilities so that we can engage the profound questions with which we'll conclude. I do a kind of sociology that is not only about explaining things, but also about hoping to help shape the transformations in which we're living by posing better questions, by helping people understand better the context in which they're working, and of course, informing my own questions by engaging people active in transformational work themselves. So here's the outline. We'll begin with epoch end, talk about meanings of solidarity, and we're going to focus in on what I call transformational solidarity. And it's because of this talk that I'm actually thinking about transformational solidarity in a new way. So this is why it's really nice to be able to be invited to give such a talk. I'll focus on three cases: Polish Solidarity Movement, Ukrainian Solidarity. By the way, when I do this hashtag UKR Solidarity, that's an indicator that I'm on what has been known as Twitter. And so if you want to see things that I think are relevant to Ukrainian solidarity, just click on @prof_Kennedy and hashtag Ukraine or UKR Solidarity. I'm looking at people who I've taught before and they go, yeah, we know. Here's something important. Not every sociologist would say, I'm only a sociologist. I mean, we're actually kind of a proud group, I would say. But actually, when it comes to this, one of the things I have to say is that I'm not really grounded in any of these solidarities that I'm talking about, in the sense that I'm not Polish, I'm not Ukrainian, and I don't have a direct familial stake in Israel-Palestine. But I choose to have these stakes. Because if we don't all have a stake in these transformations, it will be worse. Especially since we're living in, I think, what is fairly called epoch end. And if you didn't believe what I said, just look at those pictures. Now, of course, I was a little playful by saying that, but I'm curious. Do you know what this represents? Actually, very close. I mean, it is about the Anthropocene. This is the image that, when you Google epoch end, you typically get Anthropocene, because naming that geological era is a way of signaling that we are entering a new age in which humans are disproportionately affecting climate, and that climate is not in good shape. How about that? Do anybody know what that's referencing? Thank you. I was going to actually ask Olga if she would say it because she's got the mass signaling that COVID is still around. Anybody recognize what this epoch end is here? Epoch ends are not always global or planetary. Huh?
Hawaii burning.
Yeah, Hawaii burning, Maui, Lahaina. How about here? Which war? Yeah, because you could probably read that, am I right? Would you tell us what this is?
Children. It's the muddy theater.
Yes. And this, you know, I tried to imagine what image to use to signal Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a part of the Epoch End. And this was very early on a signal that this was a different kind of war, one that was disregarding human rights and even the question of war crimes. Because you can read Yeti from the skies. So what I've been doing before this most recent promise of Epoch End has been to think about, well, what do we mean when we use it? Not everyone uses that term, but we use something akin, apocalypse, cataclysm, and so on. And so I sat back in a series of lectures, actually for Poland in September of 2022, to work through this definition of what it could be, and then to think about how to actually analyze them. Not just by hovering from some kind of point of view from nowhere, but actually trying to move into the middle of the cataclysms themselves to think about what their dynamics are. And if you want to see a diagram at the end, I'll be happy to give it to you, but I won't burden you with that now. To think about how to understand those cataclysms from within, but then to think about how do they connect to other cataclysms elsewhere. Because if there's one thing about Epoch End we should keep in mind, if it's just a singular Epoch End, maybe it's manageable. But when you have so many Epoch Ends building on top of one another, it becomes beyond anyone's ken. And it turns into less a matter of how we address the crisis and more how do we manage the crisis at multiple fronts. So this paper finally came out. I shouldn't say finally because academics always take too long. But I just want to begin with this particular Epoch End crisis. I mean, I don't know if you approach these moments of exasperation like I do, but I was reading some particular article, and I just thought about how the escalation of violence seems to have no obvious end in mind. So I penned that, and I don't know, I'm not a literary person. I can't tell how good that is, but it's how I felt at the time, and you can probably see in that exasperation. But the last thing we need is exasperation. We do need to think about hope, and one of the places for hope that I find is in solidarity. But before we turn to solidarity, I can tell that there are people in the room who would recognize what these images represent, right? The upper left is the most obvious, right? What is this? Fall of the Berlin Wall, right? And I've been writing about 1989 for decades. And it always frustrated me that we always used this image, the fall of the Berlin Wall, to signal the end of that epoch in 1989. I would have rather people thought about that image on the bottom right. I think Palazzi is Nile. I think Poles know what that is, but not. So all the non-Polish people in the room, can you tell us what that is? Any of the non-Polish people in the room. The Polish people in the room can say, right? Czy mam rację? The Polish Round Table of 1989. So the reason I like to think about the images that we use for the accounts that we draw is that this fit perfectly with the idea that communism ended as a system collapse. It just collapsed because it was entirely dysfunctional or too contradictory or for some reason external to the agency of actors themselves. The reason I like to think about it in terms of the Polish Roundtable is not just because I'm more Polish than I am German, but because I like to think about how actors shape change. The Polish Roundtable negotiations of 1989 were a profound example of how solidarity actually shaped the history of the world, at least communism's end in Europe. But I then take that as a more general point of guidance to ask how solidarities can make alternative futures. We are living in a time where alternative solidarities will matter a lot. So what do we think of when we think of solidarity? So many definitions. But I like to think about these bonds of mutual obligation, typically generated very easily when you have a common foe. Most easily seen in war. And there's even some good sociology about how combat units generate profound kinds of solidarity. We might even think about that as a kind of traditional solidarity, where you have a common foe, of course you'll stand together. But we can also think about how solidarity works in less deadly circumstances. We can see this in labor struggles, struggles over inclusion, all sorts of things. You can think about even GLOW, the Graduate Labor Organization, as an example of solidarity being made and trying to shape change. But we can also think about solidarity in less profound ways, less obligatory ways. We can think of it in terms of even geopolitical alliances, because very often we'll talk about, for example, an alliance of democracies as being based on a kind of solidarity. Or we can think about mutual recognition across decolonizing struggles as a kind of solidarity. And we can even think about solidarity in more profound ways too. And I would wish that we would. Around compassion, even around love. I've been reading much more of bell hooks in recent years. And, oh, this is not quite the right one, but this is not my final. Anyway, I gave you the quote from bell hooks, and I was also going to give you a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, which I just heard doing yoga this morning. And that is that spiritual union is realized when you can share in the joy and the pain of others. So there are so many different ways to think about solidarity, and that's not to discourage, but that is to invite more thought about what it's like. But in order to express solidarity, you have to see people. You have to recognize them. And so here's another test. What is the top left representing? Our Ukrainian colleagues will know, right? This is a good example of when Russia invaded Ukraine, how many people left and came to Poland and other places for refuge, especially women and children. The next is less well known. The next picture is also in the Polish border, but the Polish border with Belarus, where refugees were not welcomed, but treated as a threat to security. How about the third? You can't recognize easily what a young woman in distress represents. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's extraordinary that Nagorno-Karabakh has been ethnically cleansed. And yet, it is not part of our global discussions. It's worth thinking about why that is. This represents, obviously, a European Union gathering with Israeli leaders This represents Palestinians carrying dead children. And what does this represent? Sudan. How much are we talking about Darfur now? Hardly, in comparison to the travesty that exists there. So when we're thinking about solidarity, when we're thinking about compassion and love, one of the things I encourage us to think about is how that very act of solidarity is implying a kind of recognition. Who deserves our solidarity? It also encourages us to think about who is even seen when we're considering how to exercise our compassion and love. One of the things that was written by a Ukrainian scholar in the New York Times just in the last few days was complaining about the attention economy. She said properly, "I will not compete with those who are suffering in Israel-Palestine for your attention. I will not be treated as a child where the adults are going to be paying attention to those in the room." But even if she won't, and I admire her principle, there is this thing, Zeynep Tufekci, another sociologist, talks about the attention economy, and it's real. And so the struggle for attention, the struggle for recognition, is an important part of the process of thinking about how solidarity works. But that is itself part of the transformational solidarity that we should be thinking about. Not just of our mutual support, but who we're going to include in that mutual support. So, I began using the term in about 2015. I had just finished this book, Globalizing Solidarity, that Paulina mentioned. And in it, I talked about consequential solidarity. I was emphasizing the kind of solidarity that one could see by activists in Pennsylvania, for example, who were trying to shut down the factory that was making the tear gas that Egyptian authorities were using to suppress protests during the Arab Spring. I initially meant it to focus on those kinds of transformations that were altering the power relations or social relations of the conditions they were objecting to or trying to engage. But you could see that most obviously, and this is from my whole academic career because I began on the Polish Solidarity movement in 1980-81, and it exemplifies this transformational solidarity because it created an actor with whom the communists had to negotiate. There was nothing like it before. There were protests, but there wasn't a self-organized independent trade union that existed in relative freedom over 15 or 16 months, charting the course of Polish and global history. But there's also something about transformational sociology that I just realized in preparation for this. It is also transforming the sense of what we mean when we say we. When we're thinking about who we are, we often can think about, well, we here at Brown, or we here in the United States. But it's really hard to do that, at Brown in particular, because we're such a global and transnational group. We have to be thinking about the relationships internationally, and even locally. When we think of Brown's place in Rhode Island, we're not just Brown, the University of the World. We are also Brown in Providence, in Rhode Island. In fact, when I wrote this, I must have been subliminally recalling Teresa Toranska, who wrote first a book called Oni, Them, and then another book called Me, or We. So I want to conclude today by, I'm stopping at 5 no matter what. I want to conclude today by thinking about who we are at Brown, and by thinking about Israel-Palestine in particular. But I want us to be thinking about Israel-Palestine in particular by thinking about Poland and Ukraine first. So let's think about Poland first. I have 4 images for you. And Paulina hasn't seen these images, so she doesn't know whether she should be nervous or not. Okay, 4 images. I don't know if the non-Poles in the room would have any idea of what any of these are, but this is easily the most universally known, because this is 1979, when Pope John Paul II came to Poland. He was, after all, Karol Wojtyła, formerly Cardinal of Kraków. And he came to Poland in 1979, in the year I graduated from college. And I remember reading about this. This was before I had any idea that I should become Polish. But this was a remarkable event because it transformed the sense of what it meant to be Polish. It didn't turn everyone into a Catholic, but it turned everyone into recognizing that they were not alone, that they, in their alienation from the communist regime, actually had millions of people together with them. Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, also did something profound. Communists appropriated the language of liberation and used it as an instrument of domination. Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, gave them a language with which to express their alienation and their hope. And one of those words that he gave them was dignity. Dignity is a powerful term, a term of transformational solidarity. Genevieve Zubrzycki was what do you call this series? Talking Pole. She was the second talking pole in this series. I'm the third. I was raised Catholic, so I do think in threes. And so Genevieve did this remarkable book. Genevieve is my former colleague at University of Michigan, and had this done as another sociologist, and did this remarkable book on the transformation of Polishness and the ways in which philo-Semitism is now such a significant part of what it means to be Polish. I can think back, Jan Gross has written such important work on the denial by so many Poles of their implication in the Holocaust. But now we are seeing so many Poles recognizing the significance of Polish Jewish culture in the definition of what it means to be Polish. Genevieve's book, for me, is an example of transformational solidarity too, redefining who we are. These 2 pictures just make me very happy because they reflect a recent transformation in Polishness, at least in terms of who rules in Poland, if we can ever get the government established. But this is an indicator that some people at least wondered whether the mobilization of women, especially around reproductive rights, might actually change who gets to rule in Poland. It might sound familiar in the United States as well. And then finally, this is also an indicator of how profound the connection is between the struggle for reproductive rights and gender equality with recognition for LGBTQ rights. It's not automatic by any means. I had a student at the University of Michigan who wrote about the ways in which trans folks were excluded from LGBTQ alliances, solidarities. So this, for me, is a representation of transformational solidarity in Poland. And you can see why, for someone who's interested in making the world better, Poland is not a bad place to focus. But it would be misleading for you to think about this as a result of strategic work. It's filled with misrecognition, accents, happenstance, conjuncture. Not everyone in the room will recognize this, but this is the transformational moment, a symbol of it at least, in August 1980, where Polish workers occupied the Lenin shipyards in Gdańsk and provided the nucleus for the development of the Solidarity movement and the agreement on August 31st to allow for the formation of independent trade unions. The Poles in the room might recognize this picture. I don't know if the Poles in the room will recognize this person. Does anyone know her? Huh? No! This is my trick.
What?
This is my trick on you. No. Jadwiga Staniszkis. So Jadwiga Staniszkis is another Polish sociologist. Notice how much sociology I'm throwing in here. And she was one of 7 so-called experts to go to the Gdańsk shipyards to advise the workers about how to engage the authorities. I got to know her when I was there in 1983, so I didn't even know her at this age, which is, from an earlier period. But she and I have remained in touch over these decades. And what she tells us about this period is quite remarkable. And that is that the intellectuals came in to advise the workers not to go too far. Be careful. You know that the communist system cannot allow for independent trade unions. And the workers rejected that advice. And they pushed for it regardless. So one of the things that I love about this juxtaposition is that while intellectuals may think they know more, they don't always. And that there are social dynamics, one of the things sociology talks about all the time, are unacknowledged conditions of action and unanticipated consequences of action. Solidarity represents that profoundly. Roundtable you've already seen. The reason the roundtable winds up becoming important is that it becomes the vehicle of the radical but nonviolent transformation of communist rule in Europe, at least in the northern parts. In the south, across the southern tier, in the Caucasus and Yugoslavia, of course, violence accompanied communism's end. But here, the Polish Roundtable became a vehicle, but it wasn't engineered to become a vehicle for communism's complete dissolution. It was designed as a compromise across communist authorities, solidarity activists, both of whom were afraid of more radical elements taking over the dynamics, and Catholic Church officials, who were the moderators in between. We organized a conference Paulina referenced at the University of Michigan in 1999. It's probably the most important thing I ever did in my life. It was because we brought together people from the Solidarity tradition, people from the communist tradition, and church members to talk about how that happened in 1989. Because nobody knew what was going to happen, but they had to figure a mechanism of change. And in the process of this roundtable negotiation, now seen as perhaps the ultimate betrayal of Poland by the alliance of Reds and Pinkos, quote unquote, at the time, it was completely uncertain. And I'm happy to talk about it at length, but I wanted to mention this one thing. Remember John Paul II and dignity. We were at great risk at University of Michigan for having this event because we invited those communists. And somehow we got the direct blessing from John Paul II that this event was meaningful. It is, as I quote the letter that we received. And you think I'm a happy guy? The day we got that letter, I was ecstatic. So let's get now to the types of solidarity so we can get into the really meaty discussion. You can see solidarity in communities like we're in right now. We have direct social ties. I don't know everyone in this room, but I hope after today I will. Sociologists often will talk about solidarity as a kind of interdependency, most obviously with the division of labor by Emil Durkheim. We can see it obviously in terms of categories. Nationalism is a great example of solidarity. Not all solidarities are emancipatory. But there's also a solidarity, and this I'm indebted to Craig Calhoun for, emphasizing how solidarity emerges dialogically through communication. In the public sphere, even when we're disagreeing, we're at least recognizing and seeing one another. and engaging potentially in transformative conversation. The university should be that. In fact, if you saw President Paxson's November 7th, 2023 account of what happened in the faculty meeting, you can see that reliance, that we are all in this together, that by communication, by mutual understanding, we will be together. But I think there's another way to think about solidarity, and more than just whether the form of solidarity, but the goal of solidarity. I think we can think about it as transformational. Under what conditions does that mutuality change the terms of social association and social transformation? It's a real serious sociological question. We can see it most obviously in how Polish workers defied intellectuals' recognition of the possible in the formation of solidarity. We can see it in the roundtable negotiations where enemies negotiated on the basis of a common Polishness, despite the fact that they hated each other. And we can see it in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where there was the promise, and maybe there still is, of a promise not only of Ukrainian sovereignty, but of a more global transformation based on solidarity and dignity itself. Dignity, of course, for the Ukrainians in the room, was profoundly evident in Maidan in 2013. This was, some sociologist, Mikhailo Vinitsky, for example, called this the revolution of dignity. This is a much less commonly known image. I'm just curious whether anyone, Poles or Ukrainians in the room, would recognize it. It's blurry.
It's the cemetery
Outside of Lviv, yeah. So this was a remarkable moment of transformational solidarity, where Kwasniewski, whom we mentioned before, and different Ukrainian premiers negotiated how to recognize that Polish-Ukrainian violence in 1919. Because in the same cemetery, you had Poles and Ukrainians buried. And there's a profound debate about how to recognize that incredible violence 100 years later. Because Poles and Ukrainians were looking for ways to develop a solidarity, and they knew they had to have a historical foundation for it. They could not bury the past without actually thinking about how to bury it so that they could imagine a future together. So now let's just move into the more immediate. These are pictures I took when I went to Tallinn last year outside the Russian embassy, suggesting the kind of discourse that was permeating the Tallinn public square. In that, and in other conversations that I'm happy to hear from others later, one of the things that is absolutely clear is that this war has generated a sense of Ukrainianness that is more powerful than has ever existed. Ever. That means also redefining Russianness. Some Ukrainians would love to emphasize the blur, and of course there are many families who have families in Russia and families in Ukraine. The Soviet Union encouraged this kind of cosmopolitanism. But through 2014 and through the rest of the war, this kind of distinction was being made. And being made in a way that was actually, again, transformative. Because so many people kept on saying, this is Putin's war, this is what Putin is doing. But Ukrainians were transforming the sense of what this was about. And one of the ways in which they were proposing the change of sense is to recognize the kind of regime and the kind of invasion this was. That this was an expression of rashism. This combination of racism on the one hand and fascism on the other. And it was not just Putin. It was the whole of the society that has been polluted and enabling the kind of invasion that has taken place. This invasion has caused a profound transformation in at least part of the world. Finland and Sweden were always fond of staying out of NATO. As a consequence of 2022's invasion, Finland and Sweden now won into NATO. Now, NATO borders on Russia like never before. It's not just a European thing, though. If you look at the top right, you'll see that countries across the world have provided military aid, not just humanitarian aid, military aid to Ukraine. Another dramatic example of global solidarity has been the support for refugees, especially in Europe, especially in Poland. But if you look, Estonia, as a share of the population, has supported more than Poles. So if you think about this, you can see that this is a dramatic change of how we might think about solidarity and how we might even think about refugees. But always keep in mind that some refugees are welcome and others are not. Finally, this gets to the problem I would like to raise with you and ask for your help in thinking through. And that is that notice the light gray are those places that endorsed a UN vote on condemning Russia's invasion. Russia and a few of its allies, 4 to be exact, I think, in the initial vote, voted in solidarity with Russia. But most, China, India, South Africa, and many other important countries in the so-called global South, abstain, or at least take the middle position. I can't remember the official term. What does that mean? It certainly means that Biden's vision of a global solidarity with Ukraine is not feasible. But it means something else too. It means that there is a chance, there was, I should at least say, a chance for a transformation in these solidarities. One of the things that was most remarkable to me was the ways in which we could be thinking about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine could change the sense of what colonialism means, imperialism means, and anti-colonial struggles mean. Because this was a clear example of a colonizing power invading the colonized. But there's a problem. I was talking with Neha yesterday in office hours, and that is, we were talking about Weber's elective affinity idea. There's an elective affinity between Russia and emancipatory struggles because of the Cold War, because of the resistance the Soviet Union provided to those resisting Western colonialism. So there's a problem there, but that problem was potentially changing. On the very time when the UN was debating what was happening with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Representative Martin Kinani from Kenya stood up and said, "This is what we have also experienced." This was also growing too, when the assaults on Ukrainian shipments of grain were spreading. Folks from Africa, especially the Ghanaian leader, said, this is not just an assault on Ukraine, this is an assault on our own survival. Ukrainians were not just beneficiaries of this recognition. There was extensive diplomatic efforts by Ukrainians to try to reach out across the global south. Africans were properly skeptical of this kind of solidarity, but what's really fascinating to look at is the ways in which Africans themselves were talking about, well, what does this prompt us to consider? In particular, if we want to think of ourselves as being non-aligned, what does that mean? Does it mean neutrality in these wars? Or does it mean solidarity with those who seek to defend their sovereignty? This is a space for thinking about transformational solidarity. And lastly, it inspired even more dramatic conversation. There's a person here at Brown with whom I'm looking forward to having conversations about this. A sociologist who's got his PhD at University of Wisconsin, Madison in the late 70s, who's also a former South African diplomat. But here's the point. I can't give you this lecture that I would have given 4 months ago, because the terms are changing too dramatically. And so I want to go through that very quickly, because I said I would end at 5. Those who know me know that I love the Sewellian list from Bill Sewell. These are the terms that you might look at when you come back to this PowerPoint as soon as you get home. To think about how to explain social change. I don't talk about all of them now, but I just want to reference here to think about the transposability of schema. How actors can take schema developed in one part of the world and apply it to their own. You can see that dramatically in what was happening in Ukraine. This is a war against the colonizers. But nothing is so simple anymore. We now have a circumstance where existential fears are driving global politics in profound ways. And it's not just in Israel-Palestine, as we know. It's radiating outward. It's invoking and reestablishing traditional racisms and solidarities. It is reestablishing the salience of the equivalence between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It is provoking debates about the difference between the right to defend yourself and whether this is revenge or even genocide. And traditional solidarities are a part of that. But it's misleading to think of these as ancient wars. The wars of Yugoslav succession taught us that. These are all transformations. For example, one of those remarkable things in the world today is this dramatic expansion of solidarity with Palestinians. Rashida Tlaib, in the upper right-hand corner, where she evoked a certain phrase that she understood to be an aspirational call for freedom, human rights, and peaceful coexistence, not death, destruction, or hate. Looking in the middle, Iman Abdelhadi, a sociologist with a PhD from the University of Michigan, but now at University of Chicago, said when she went to the demonstration in DC that this was the most remarkable demonstration that she's ever been to. And she's not the only one. And then, of course, what has happened here at Brown in the last 24 hours. The occupation of the building, the administration building, is one of those potentially eventful transformations that we should be aware of. Because it is forcing a conversation that is not just about mutual respect, but about how to recognize the events in the world. This is a dramatic issue that needs to be attended to, and I give credit to those who think about what prompts serious engagement like this. But I also want to recognize that there are profound transformations in the sense of what Israeli identity means as well. I mean, just in the paper today, I was drawn to Jason Rubenstein's account of what it means, what anti-Semitism means. And it is one of those transformative accounts that helps to justify why some will say that there is no way to separate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Because anti-Semitism is about the fear of powerful Jews. And Jews have never been more powerful in the world than they are with an Israeli state. At least this is what his argument was. And then we have other conversations which are profoundly transformative, at least for me, because I'm not steeped in the Jewish tradition. But certainly Peter Beinart has been writing some amazing things lately and expressing the quest for holding two thoughts at once. Being able to say, I love my Jewish community, my Jewish family, and at the same time expressing profound regret and even anger for how that love can be instrumentalized or even weaponized to cause harm that is unnecessary. I'm obviously not steeped enough in any tradition here to be able to say what ought to be, but I am a sociologist of solidarity and recognizing the profound transformations that are taking place. I am, however, Irish. And just engaging the Irish debates about Israel-Palestine has been fascinating. Fintan O'Toole, I don't know if you know him, but he's now at Princeton, but he writes for the Irish News, Irish Times. He reminds us that there was an incredible affinity between Zionists struggling against the British Empire and Irish struggling against the British Empire. But now, today, the Irish are among the most pro-Palestinian in the European Union. Surprising, yeah? But this is the biggest one. Where is Ukraine in the Israel-Palestine war? I had these separated before, sorry. But this is, the first statement comes from one of Ukraine's advisors to the president, indicating the full stop support of Israel by Ukraine. For many reasons, not least of which, Golda Meir was born in Kiev. On the other hand, there is this powerful letter from a variety of Ukrainian intellectuals and artists and even a few sociologists talking about the obviousness of Ukrainian-Palestinian solidarity. So I take these examples as really illustrative of the epoch end in which we're living. There is no obvious solidarity because principles are contradicting. Social identifications are convulsing. Geopolitical realism is alienating. And so the university becomes more important than ever. Clearly, we need to take care of one another. But we have to be able to imagine moving beyond who we are to whom we might become. Transformational solidarity is never built on the smooth extension of the present into the future. Never. President Paxson, in her letter to the faculty, offered these 4 priorities based on a smooth extension of who we are into the future. And I endorse all 4 of them. But we need to think beyond those 4. We need to model what intellectual responsibility is as a community. There was this article in the New York Times recently about how universities should not retreat into their ivory towers because the discourse has gotten so toxic. Written by the international affairs deans at Columbia and Princeton. So, how do you generate this transformational solidarity within university spaces? Protect academic freedom, obviously. But be clear about how it's threatened. It's not just threatened by us being hostile to each other. It's also threatened by those outside universities threatening certain forms of speech. We need to work with empathy. And in fact, the more we act hatefully toward one another, the more the conversation becomes about us and not the issue itself. We need to be mindful of how people are vulnerable, and we need to be respectful and caring. But we also need to think about how to move things ahead. So, for example, we could debate who's right in saying what from the river to the sea means. We can debate that. Does the person who's saying it own it? Or does the person who hears it define it? It's a really interesting question. But this is why I'm so happy to be part of this letter that was distributed through the Brown Daily Herald yesterday. I was hoping it would happen before this lecture. I will share some excerpts, for our discussion, so that those of you who have not seen it might think about it. But I want to invite you to offer any comments, supplement everything, even challenge everything, right? Because we want to model intellectual responsibility, and intellectual responsibility doesn't happen by only being polite. But it also happens if we can be respectful in our differences. And I'd love to hear reflections on Polish solidarity, reflections on Ukrainian solidarity, reflections on solidarity in these most challenging times on this campus. I had something else in the newer version, but I lost it. So I want to be able to conclude when I leave this room that I feel like there's a better definition of us right now. That we are able, despite our differences, and maybe because of our differences, to find a better definition of us. I'm repetitive. So thank you very much. And I'll take whatever applause. So that you can see at least part of that.
Thank you for your lecture. I'm sure you've covered lots of things, lots of thoughts. Hopefully it generated lots of thoughts. So I would like to invite questions if there are any from the audience. I think we don't need the microphone since the room is fairly small. Maybe I can ask the first one, right? Since I am here. So I was thinking in terms of, so you focused a lot about you talk about transformational solidarity in Ukraine, and how the idea of solidarity is formed very often by defining a common foe. And I think when it comes to Ukraine, that's actually the case. Do you think this is the only productive way of thinking about transformational solidarity, and could we go outside of thinking of solidarity, let's say in Ukraine, as opposition to Russia, or solely by defining that this is the enemy and that's what brings us together? Because, I mean, there's lots of positive highlights in what you say, but I think in the conflict right now there is some very strong animosity, national animosity. So I was thinking, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think Ukrainian solidarity right now is based on something more than just in opposition to Russia, or by defining the Russian foe?
You mean Polish solidarity with Ukraine or European solidarity?
No, the Ukrainian.
Ukraine.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So every community is going to have its own contests, and they are going to be distinguished by the ways in which those contests are resolved. So if I can step to the United States for a moment, one of the things that's remarkable right now is the debates about how we resolve our differences, and to what extent truthfulness matters, to what extent owning the libs matter. We can see in Ukraine the seeds of that, but it's not going to be seen for a while until this war is resolved. We can see the seeds of powerful difference and antagonism, even now, between Poles and Ukrainians, thinking about what to do with the grain and whether it's going to be depressing Polish farmers' incomes. But the hope, I think, embedded in the idea of Polish, Ukrainian, European democratic solidarity is that this is more than a fight against an enemy. It's about a fight for principles. The dilemma is that many folks in the global south will properly recognize that these principles are only a matter of convenience, especially if you compare American invasion of Iraq with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what I was hoping, and the struggle for Poland and Ukraine, would be that those principles would become better anchored. But now with Israel-Palestine war transforming everything, those principles are being shot to hell.
Yeah, because it seems like there are two competing solidarities, so it's difficult to like make sense of like how do you create this like bigger solidarity, that does not bring these huge divisions, right?
So this
because
is
solidarities are usually have some kind of competing principles, like one solidarity would have a different principles than.
So this is why, unfortunately this version of the PowerPoint doesn't have it, but I was emphasizing so much what is the name of the organization? Brown Jews for ceasefire. This is an example of a solidarity that's based on a principle that is less about our common enemy and more about what we seek. And that is so important for Brown to embrace, because those divisions, those enemies, are tearing campuses apart. To have Brown Jews for peace or ceasefire is a great way of signaling how we can have that transformational solidarity. And Brown can build on its legacy of student activism, leading to progressive change within the university in this moment with that example. Message for some.
Okay, are there any other questions to Professor Kennedy regarding the topic? Will, go ahead.
I have a quick one. And I'm not super well versed in like global relations or whatever the correct word for it is, but I've been hearing that some countries like the U.S. and other countries that have supported Ukraine have been like pushing peace talks towards the Ukraine-Russia war, and I was just wondering, how do you think that affects their sense of Ukrainianness and like solidarity with themselves, if they have people that are supporting them now like kind of pushing for them to concede and to give up some of the things they're fighting so hard for?
So this is a debate that's taking place on so many different levels. It's within the United States, of course. It's within Europe. Nobody wants to be supporting Ukraine at the financial level that they are. So there's a lot of arguments that say, let's come back from this kind of investment in Ukraine and be real. And we'll force the Ukrainians to negotiate with Russia. The problem that I have with this argument is that it infantilizes Ukraine. It tells Ukraine what we think they should do. And Ukraine has invested much more of itself than any other nation in the world in this struggle. So whenever I hear these debates, almost never are Ukrainians mentioned. It's always what Russia wants, what America will suffer. So I am willing to listen. I want to hear those debates, especially by bringing Ukrainians into the conversation, not excluding them on the basis of some kind of superpower dialogue, which incidentally reproduces colonialism once again, instead of thinking about this as an anti-colonizing discourse. But thank you for raising it. It's really important right now.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I have two questions, but they are interrelated, if I may ask them. First, despite of your move at the end to speak more about the recent events, I would like to start more with the Solidarities and to ask you how did we end up in a place, if we think about Solidarność as a movement, with its vision of the means of struggle and of its political project, of non-violent means of having this very future-oriented, and of having this potentiality of having these negotiations, because when you said it was about Polishness, but it seems it was also about Polishness as a project of common well-being, right, that this bridge was put in. How we came to this very different vision of what is endorsed as the means of struggle, and how there was another banner of one of these rallies, by any means necessary, which we can all understand what does it mean, and with a very, very different understanding of what is possible, and how it, like, what means to have political struggles and resistance. And I think in this way that there is a polar difference between what we are witnessing. And also I wanted to ask regarding your last point about that it's not important not to remain in ivory tower but to engage, but whether there is a specific, whether it's ethical stance or anything from academic contribution that makes it specific or different from other contributions. So whether there is a certain responsibility or ethics of acting or speaking as academics, because also, for instance, like it happened that I was also acquainted with some of the authors with this Ukrainian letter, like about solidarity with Palestinian people. But then when we also started just discussing, like it appears that people, although like signing it as in the name of academic, they are not very interested in the history of the conflict also. Like, you know, that there is always can be a kind of presentation of one thing while obliviating others. So I would be very grateful for your comments.
So if you haven't been able to tell from this, pair of questions, you should get to know Olga. She'll be teaching a course next spring, right? Because she's been such a terrific interlocutor. Just in a few months, she's been here at the Watson Institute as a postdoctoral fellow. So the second point, I don't know how to answer very thoughtfully, except to say that whenever I see petitions as a form of academic solidarity or intellectual solidarity, I always find them flat, especially when they're not connected to subsequent action. And so the difference for me in thinking about the petition that I just signed and that petition is that for the faculty who signed this petition in solidarity with thinking about how to move us beyond a perspective here and a perspective here, it's because we're here. And that's a signal to people who are interested in furthering this conversation. So there is follow-up. And in fact, one of the things that has happened here is that the faculty solidarity and the student movement are now connected. And how to imagine that connection moving forward is itself way more than just names on a page. But the names on a page enable us to recognize one another. Then the second, more profound question, if I can say, is that we're in different epochs. Nonviolent resistance today still exists, and it's powerful. But it's harder to sustain when there is so much violence in the discourse. By any means necessary may have been associated with Malcolm X, but it was also right next to Martin Luther King, and all sorts of discourse about what is the proper way. When it comes to the discourse, for example, I have turned down signing petitions of solidarity with Palestinian struggles if they don't mention the horror of October 7th. And that is a choice, a moral choice, a strategic choice that people make. I can't do it. I can't do it because I have seen too many quote-unquote emancipatory movements, communist movements among them, becoming the very opposite of what they promise. Ethical resistance is a meaningful term for me. But rather than turn this into a simple epochal comparison, and I'll stop soon, I want to emphasize once again the strategic and intentional actions of people like Zbigniew Bujak in the Solidarity movement, who was one of the people who evaded capture by the Polish communists after the declaration of martial law. I got to know him in the mid-'80s. And I included his reflections in my second book, where he said, we were constantly being provoked by the communists to respond in violent ways, constantly. And we knew that if we did, we would be not only defeated with violent terms, but we would also lose the moral battle. He recalled taking all of these armaments and throwing them in the Vistula River. It would have been possible to have that violent confrontation. But if that had happened, the likelihood of a peaceful end to communist rule would have also been much less likely. The difference for Ukraine, though, is that, to my mind, Ukraine had no option other than to violently resist. And therefore, one of the things we have to think about is not just whether you have ethical resistance, it's also the character of aggression in the world. This is a Russian invasion almost by any means necessary.
But also, I'm sorry, but also
Please.
Ukrainian army, like there are reports that it doesn't commit war crimes also on prisoners of war, which I think is very important after
That's
the
a good point.
brutality.
Thank you. And that is really, yeah.
Yeah, and even if I may add, within the Polish Solidarity movement, there was a fracture of Solidarność Walcząca, which was the fighting solidarity that precisely advocated this involvement of struggle force and more violent means to actually overthrow the communism. And that was laid the foundation of the split in Polish society right now between the right and left. So there were within the solidarity already competing solidarities of how do we understand the solidarity with one another to overthrow communism, let's say. Yeah.
Russian.
Okay, I don't think we have more questions, more time, but there are questions. Okay, go ahead, Nikolai.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. You delineated several instances of solidarity, transformative solidarity. One instance of solidarity that I can think of that maybe, I don't think you pointed out, maybe you don't even see this as solidarity, but was the unison of boycotting certain voices, silencing certain voices, and stopping debate between certain areas. I'm talking more of the Russia-Ukraine situation. So I'm interested, what do you think?
Can you be more specific so I can understand?
Is it fruitful to join in solidarity, like against, rather than, instead of joining on principles, joining on the common foe ground? Is it fruitful to silence parts of a country simply on grounds that they have a certain passport, as creating this like black and white division? Because I don't see this solidarity as being fruitful because it actually silences debates rather than encourages them. And so I wonder what you thought of that, or like if you have an opinion.
So this is, so tell me your name again?
Nick.
Nick, this is such a good illustration of why we should think about different kinds of solidarity. Because solidarity can be itself totalitarian. It could be forcing unison. But then that's not solidarity. That's not mutual. That's imposed. And so for me, I was just reading an article about solidarity from the ground up. It's very different from an authoritarian solidarity imposed by someone's vision of what's necessary. So I agree that that's dangerous, especially because it winds up suppressing differences that need to be articulated so that if there's a chance to have a more open discussion, they don't explode, as in the divisions within Poland after communist rule. So I think we agree more than it would sound.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll end here, but if there are any questions, you can always come to Michael and talk to him privately, in more private setting. Thank you again for participating, and feel free